Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Tuesday, November 20th.
We will take care of every patient that arrives here today, as we did yesterday morning or any time in the future. You'll get the best care possible.
Mercy Hospital is up and running again after yesterday's shooting that took the lives of a doctor, a pharmacist, and a police officer.
It's a very complex situation. It's a shame, but it is what it is.
President Trump says the U.S. stands with Saudi Arabia despite the murder of a Washington Post journalist by agents of the Saudi regime. Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me host Peter Sagal on his new book on running and life lessons.
It's a transformative moment for music, for youth culture, for the 60s.
The night Bob Dylan went electric, a local museum has the songwriter's legendary guitar. Monsters, musicals, and must-sees. Hetty Weiss is here with some recommendations for what's good on stage. And Jeffrey Bear ushers in a story about the man behind a crowd control empire in tonight's Ask Jeffrey. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. Another police officer shot in the line of duty. Brandis Friedman has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Brandis.
And Phil, a Chicago police officer is in stable condition at Advocate Christ Hospital tonight after being shot during a traffic stop. It happened late this morning in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood. Police say the traffic stop turned into a foot pursuit and gunfire was exchanged. The officer was struck in his body armor. The alleged offender was hit in his upper body and is in serious to critical condition at the hospital. Police say a weapon was recovered at the scene, and the Civilian Office of Police Accountability is investigating. And Paris Schutz has the latest on the shooting that killed another Chicago police officer yesterday at Mercy Hospital. That's coming up in just a couple of minutes. If you're serving salad this Thanksgiving, check to make sure you're not using romaine lettuce. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says it's working with counterparts in Canada on an outbreak of E. coli in romaine lettuce, and both are warning people to avoid eating it. So far, 32 people have gotten sick in 11 U.S. states, including Illinois. 18 others have gotten sick in Canada. The FDA says this strain of E. coli is different from the one linked to romaine lettuce earlier this year. Fewer people are signing up for insurance under the Affordable Care Act during this open enrollment period, and that has some healthcare advocates concerned. The Healthy Illinois campaign says enrollment numbers during the first week of open enrollment this year are significantly lower compared to the same time last year. They blame the Trump administration's proposed changes to rules affecting immigrants, as well as funding cuts that have prevented outreach and education programming.
People aren't getting covered. That means people may die because they don't have health insurance. They may die from something that could be prevented because they're not covered.
And the group points out that the public comments and open enrollment periods both end during the second week of December. Former President Barack Obama surprised some volunteers at the Greater Chicago Food Depository today. Obama, along with his foundation's chief engagement officer, stopped by bringing food donations, and then they helped the 60 volunteers repack potatoes to be distributed to individuals and families. The Food Depository has a network of 700 community distribution sites like food pantries and soup kitchens and serves the equivalent of 159,000 meals every day. The former president was in town for the Obama Foundation Summit, which was held on Monday. As for the weather, mostly cloudy tonight with a low around 27. Then tomorrow, mostly cloudy with a high near 34, but no precipitation in the forecast for all you holiday travelers. And don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also watch via podcast and the PBS video app. Now, Phil, back to you.
Thank you, Brandis. We are learning more today about the victims and the alleged killer in yesterday's attack at Mercy Hospital. Today, hospital officials say they are offering grief counseling around the clock as medical staff goes back to work. Paris Schutz has the latest on the fallout. Paris, what's up?
And Phil, Mercy says they are back to near full capacity after yesterday's tragic shooting. They opened the emergency department back up just after noon today, where a lot of that incident took place yesterday. And they said that they'll care for any and all patients that come their way, despite an emergency department where staff is truly grieving the loss of some of their own.
As we walk around, we can see the pain. Everyone, nurses, technicians, our own security staff, there's no one not touched by this. So the first thing we knew we had to do was heal one another. And so and once again, the chaplains who have been here are here now and are making the rounds on every floor to every group of individuals with counseling and words of encouragement and comfort.
And then the Chicago Police Department is also mourning and honoring the life of Samuel Jimenez, the 28-year-old father of 3 that was killed when he ran toward the gunshots that rang out just outside of Mercy Hospital. And the 2 hospital victims are Tamara O'Neill, the 38-year-old emergency room doctor, and Dana Less, 25-year-old resident in the pharmacy. O'Neill died after being shot in the encounter with her ex-fiance in the parking lot just outside the hospital before the perpetrator went inside, shot 2 people getting off an elevator, one of them fatally, tragically, Miss Less. Now, Mercy officials remembered O'Neill as an essential member of the emergency staff.
Any one of you, including myself, if I was in extremis and about to die, I would love for Dr. O'Neill to have been here to take care of me. Fantastic person.
Meanwhile, Dana Less was remembered today by her father as someone who had overcome health problems early in life to devote herself to helping others.
I do not want Dana remembered as a victim, and I want everyone to understand that. Dana was a very special person. She had unique gifts. She was intelligent, she was funny, she was kind, she was a good friend.
Paris, is there anything more that's known about the timeline of what happened yesterday and what the shooter's motivation might have been?
Well, we learned the identity of the shooter, 32-year-old Juan Lopez. He was attempting apparently to get his engagement ring back from Miss O'Neill after their engagement had been called off. Police say that he had legally purchased 4 guns in the last 5 years. He was a FOID card owner. He had a concealed carry permit. He was kicked out of the Chicago Fire Academy after threatening a female cadet and going AWOL. And he was also the subject of an order of protection request from an ex-wife of his. He had most recently worked for the Chicago Housing Authority, which says it conducted a background check and did not find a criminal record. And police say he used a 9mm weapon. He was struck twice, once by police officers in a gunshot wound to the abdomen, and then another from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. And last night, Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson said that Jimenez and the other officers at that scene most certainly prevented more bloodshed.
Those officers that responded today saved a lot of lives, because this guy was just shooting that poor woman that got off an elevator. Had nothing to do with nothing, and he shot her. Why? There's no doubt in my mind that all those officers that responded were heroes, and they saved a lot of lives, because we just don't know how much damage he was prepared to do.
And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Phil, nearly 40% of women shot in the workplace are shot by either domestic partner or relatives. So this is not an uncommon occurrence. And we spoke with a security expert named Matt Doherty with the Chicago firm Hillard Heinz. He says this is near epidemic levels. He says it's paramount for every workplace to make sure that women and men, anybody who's the victim of domestic violence, to feel comfortable going to HR, going to management, and saying that there is a domestic abuser in their life and relaying that information to HR. If there's an order of protection against someone, HR should know that. A front desk attendant should have a picture of that person so that they don't let that person in. Oftentimes, orders of protection do not extend to the workplace, but he acknowledges it's very difficult to do this because there's a stigma, there's a history of discrimination against employees with who are victims of domestic abuse. Perhaps they fear that they won't get promoted or hired because of the baggage. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed at every firm, especially hospitals. Hospitals are the most dangerous workplaces in the United States when it comes to the potential for workplace violence.
Paris, thank you. And now to Eddie Ruza and a controversial decision on Saudi Arabia. Eddie.
Phil, it is what it is. That's what President Trump said this afternoon about the murder of dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. His comments come after the CIA reportedly concluded that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, ordered Khashoggi's killing inside the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. Under pressure to take actions against the Saudi regime, President Trump also had this to say today.
They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China. Right now, we have oil prices in great shape. I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia. It's about America first.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also raised some eyebrows today, chalking up Khashoggi's murder to a mean, nasty world out there. Here with some local perspective on all of this are Cecile Shea, a specialist on global security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She spent more than 2 decades as a U.S. diplomat, including service in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And Khalil Marar, an associate professor at Governors State University, whose expertise includes the politics of the Middle East. Thank you both for being here tonight. Cecile Shea, something else that the president said today was that the U.S. will remain a steadfast partner of Saudi Arabia. Is the president acting in the best economic, security, and foreign policy interests of the United States?
I don't think that he is. Saudi Arabia has been a problematic country for decades, some would say the better part of a century. And we've been willing to look the other way while they exported their really problematic type of Islam, extremist, Salafist, Wahhabi Islam. Remember that most of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi citizens. Saudis have been involved in terror attacks against the United States in Saudi Arabia and in Africa, and we chose to ignore it. We've chosen to ignore Saudi's really extreme human rights abuses in Yemen, which have led to the greatest humanitarian crisis facing the globe right now. In the president's statement today, he blamed the problems in Yemen on Iran, but that's really disingenuous. Really, the Saudis are behind this, and they have a hideous human rights record at home, and we've been willing to look away because we needed their oil. And what is going on now is we aren't as dependent on Saudi oil anymore.
Khalil Marar, something else that the president has had to say today when asked whether Mohammed bin Salman was behind this killing, he said maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. And the Crown Prince has been the focus of this investigation and whether he was behind it. But would he really have acted unilaterally?
I mean, it depends on what we mean by unilaterally. I don't think that the Crown Prince had to ask for permission, if that's the question. If the question, however, is, did the United States and Saudi Arabia conspire to kill this journalist? I say no. But, we have to remember that this is the same president that has called journalists like yourself enemies of the people. And the rhetoric that Trump has engaged in has been very dangerous indeed, not to mention upending the entire international order upon which we relied for many, many, many years since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, not to violate human rights and to respect the fundamental principle of the freedom of the press, speech, etc. It doesn't matter what's going on inside of Saudi Arabia, no matter how hideous the human rights situation is. It matters much more that the United States sets a positive tone, a tone that is affirmative of human rights and not opposed to it.
So as Cecile said, at this point, the United States is not as reliant on Saudi oil as it once was. So as it stands now, who is more reliant on who at this point? The United States to Saudi Arabia, or the other way around?
I absolutely agree with Cecile that the United States in particular is not dependent as it once were on Saudi oil. Now, that's a relative dependence. We have to think in terms of in absolute terms, it's all the same pot. It's all the same oil markets. It's all the same oil pits being traded. It's all the same fungible oil. And therefore, we cannot look at the relationship as being one of only the United States depending on Saudis. A lot of people might remember the embargo in 1973. The Saudis are not capable of the same kind of action, but I fear that given that Saudi Arabia is the world's preeminent oil producer, that yes, the United States does need Saudi Arabia in order to have a stable global economy. You cannot have that without stable oil prices.
Does the United States also need Saudi Arabia to have a stable Middle East? Cecile Shea.
Well, I would argue that Saudi Arabia is an anathema to a stable Middle East. Their actions for the last 30 years of exporting Salafist Islam have destabilized the Middle East and Pakistan and Afghanistan and parts of Indonesia. They've been really a very unhelpful party in the development of Islam around the world and made the U.S. more dangerous. Frankly, they have been very problematic for our own national security, and we should not have been ignoring this for all of these decades, and we should not be ignoring it now.
The question also is whether there is truth in the amount of money that Saudi Arabia has pledged to buy armaments from the United States. The president said anywhere from $110 billion to $450 billion. No. But most observers say that it doesn't approach anywhere near that, and most of those contracts will never be fulfilled. What can you tell us?
Eddie, it's $15 billion, which is a good chunk of change, don't get me wrong. And, we shouldn't, burn our bridges when it comes to $15 billion with a B dollars. But at the same time, I don't listen, to answer your original question, I think that the United States needs Saudi Arabia, that it's in our strategic and national interest to depend on Saudi Arabia. And I somewhat disagree with Cecile, even though I think the point that she's making is a very valid one, legitimate one, that Saudi Arabia has been fueling terrorism, extremism, and Wahhabism, and all those other isms in the region and elsewhere, and exporting it abroad. But we must have also a historical memory where we look at 1979, the watershed year that turned Saudi Arabia into the state that we know today. If anything, MBS, the Crown Prince, is moving away from that brink. He's sort of like stabilizing Saudi Arabia and really sort of like moderating this fanatical, radical Islam that Saudi Arabia has, rightly so, been accused of doing. But we must remember the Iranian influence as well. In 1979, Iran has a big revolution where they're exporting Shiite extremism, not just around the Middle East, but around the world.
I guess the question is, at this point, is there a moral initiative, a moral prerogative in canceling these contracts and sanctioning the Saudis? What do you think, Cecile Shea?
Well, I think that there should be a debate on what we should do about the contracts. We should have a lot more knowledge about exactly what the weapons are. At any rate, weapon sales of this magnitude to any country are supposed to be approved by the State Department. They're supposed to be approved by the Department of Commerce. Congress normally would have a say one way or the other in these types of weapon sales. And we need to ask ourselves, as we do with any kind of weapon sales, but certainly one this enormous.
But again, related to this incident, this murder, the CIA determined that the Crown Prince and possibly his inner circle or the wider circle were behind this murder. The president has chosen not to go by that finding. Is there a moral standing that the president should be taking rather than an economic one?
I think that there is a moral standing. I think that the world is watching how we're going to react. I don't know what size of the sanctions they should be or what form they should take, but I think that there is such widespread and really bipartisan criticism of this action.
Including from Senator Lindsey Graham today, who said that he has bipartisan support for sanctions.
And let's not forget what's going on in Yemen, the horror that is going on there with these children starving to death and tens of thousands of civilian casualties. I think that it's time for action. What the action should be, I'm not prepared to say right now, in part because we don't really understand everything about these arms sales.
Khalil Marar, do you believe the CIA's findings that the Crown Prince and perhaps a wider circle of Saudi officials were behind this murder?
It's common sense. I mean, nothing happens in terms of Saudi foreign policy without the Crown Prince.
All right, so what is the reaction, do you think, from the rest of the Middle East or perhaps from the rest of the world to our foreign policy when the president has chosen to ignore that finding?
There's a sincere thank you from these autocrats and dictators and absolute monarchs. I mean, look, you have Turkey, crying crocodile tears about a murdered journalist when they have their own countless journalists that are jailed, that are imprisoned for doing things that are much less courageous and brave, in hindsight now I say this, than what Jamal Khashoggi was doing.
So it also brings up the issue of what personal interest the president might have. He says that he has no financial ties in Saudi Arabia, when that's not exactly true. The Saudis have bailed him out of a number of issues when he's had financial problems over the decades. They bought the entire 45th floor of the Trump World Tower in New York, not to be confused with the Trump Tower, which is in another part of Manhattan. And there's also the question about what interest his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, might have. Do you think this is factoring into his decision?
I worry that it's factoring into his decision. The fact is that neither Jared Kushner nor the president would be able to get any other job in the U.S. government because of their complex financial dealings and the large amount of debt that the Kushners hold right now. And so it's really problematic whenever Jared Kushner is dealing with China or dealing with Saudi Arabia, knowing that his family is desperate for an infusion of capital into their real estate empire. Similarly, because we have not seen his tax returns and he has not been very forthcoming with his own dealings, we don't know what President Trump's past or present dealings are with Saudi Arabia, and we really don't know what future ideas he has about Saudi Arabia and the amount of capital that he may hope to gain from that country. So yes, it's really problematic.
We saw some photographs just a few minutes ago of the Crown Prince. One of them was when he did his grand tour of the United States earlier this year, where he met not only with President Trump, but with the former Presidents Bush. He met with a lot of celebrities. He met with business leaders. There we're seeing that photograph again. Does this change the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, even if President Trump doesn't want it to change?
I don't think so. I mean, the president is the decider in chief. I mean, Congress is not able to act in the way that anybody who's outraged about the Khashoggi murder wants them to act. Congress is limited by constitutional design. The president is the decider in chief. The president is the one who's going to set the tone. The president has already set the tone, and it's not looking very good. And listen, when MBS came here and did this grand tour, he also had all kinds of media interviews. If folks look at those interviews, they will notice exactly what is happening right now. Freedom within limits, right? There's an old slogan that the Saudis love to sort of, talk about and or express, and that slogan is, progress without change.
So, Cecile Shea, what do you believe will change from here? Because this has been one of the most significant foreign policy determinations, I guess, coming out of this administration. In these next 2 years of his term, what will change, if anything, because of this?
Well, I think 2 or 3 things. First of all, the one thing that is clear is that MBS is not quite the brilliant politician that people thought. Turns out that he is extremely unsophisticated. He is shocked that murdering an employee of the richest man in the world, Khashoggi worked for Jeff Bezos, after all, someone who was quite popular, it turns out, on Capitol Hill, had a lot of friends in the Senate and the House, was a journalist for one of the major newspapers in the world, that he seemed shocked that anyone would have cared about this.
But in terms of the foreign policy coming out of coming out of this administration, what do you think will change? I think
we're going to see a lot less faith in MBS, and we're going to start looking for people in the House of Saud who are talking about finding another person to take the place of the king when the king dies.
Cecile Shea and Khalil Marar, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's more Chicago Tonight ahead, so please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Inland Real Estate Group of Companies.
The Inland Real Estate Group of Companies is a national financial and commercial real estate group. Always building for tomorrow, Inland has conducted over $44 billion in commercial property transactions over the last 50 years. Inland owns, manages, finances, and invests in major retail shopping centers, apartments, large-scale construction projects, student housing, and medical office and healthcare facilities. The Inland Real Estate Group of Companies, Incorporated. Born in Chicago, at home in the world of commercial real estate since 1968. To learn more, visit inlandgroup.com.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, the guitar that changed the trajectory of Bob Dylan's career and perhaps popular music in general is temporarily residing at a local museum. Hetty Weiss is here with reviews and recommendations for what to see on Chicago's stages. And Jeffrey Baer has the story of Chicago's first helicopter traffic reporters in tonight's Ask Jeffrey. But first, you may know our next guest just by the sound of his voice. He is the witty and irreverent host of NPR's news quiz show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Wait, Wait just celebrated its 20th anniversary. There he is celebrating with the show's announcer, Bill Curtis. But what you may not know about Peter Sagal is that he is an avid runner who has finished 14 marathons. His personal best marathon finish was in 3 hours, 10 minutes. That's running 26.2 miles at an average pace of about 7 minutes, 15 seconds per mile. Wow. That is quick. His latest book, The Incomplete Book of Running, is part ode to running and its benefits, part personal diary of some difficult personal times. And Peter Sagal joins us now. Peter, welcome to Chicago Tonight.
It's great to be back, Phil, but I have to correct you. It was 3 hours and 9 minutes. Oh, and I worked for that minute. Do not take it away from me.
Well, listen, I understand now. A minute in a marathon is means something.
I know, especially when you're a shallow person like myself who looks for things like that you can brag about.
Well, I sit corrected. But at 15, you took up running, and then you dropped it in college, and you picked it up again when you were 40.
Yeah.
And according to you, quote, you were inspired by your self-loathing. Explain what was going on.
Well, you know, just, well, there's running, and then there's running away. I think I was in the same place at 40 that a lot of people end up being. You're kind of amazed that it's possible to turn 40 in the first place. And you sort of look around and you say, oh my God, I'm 40. That means that someday I'll be 50, which seems even more impossible. And you start wondering where you are, and is this what you've done? Is that all there is, to quote some famous poet? And for some reason, I decided that the correct response to this existential crisis was to run a marathon, the 2005 Chicago Marathon, which I did, and it hurt. But after I finished it, I said to myself something I never expected to hear myself say in that circumstance, which was, I wonder if I can do that faster. And that started more than a decade now of very serious running and marathoning.
And you did do it a lot faster, but you start the book with your alluding to your divorce and running the Boston Marathon in 2013. That's when you were a running guide for a blind runner who was totally spent at the end, but he managed to really take it up a notch in the final mile. You've told that story before, but tell it again and what the consequences might have been if it hadn't been for his burst of energy.
Well, people may remember the 2013 Boston Marathon was a special one for reasons that no one wanted it to be special for. As you said, I was running with a wonderful man named William Greer, a blind marathoner of some repute and ability, and he was having a tough day, which often happens on marathons. As they say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And he was really suffering, but I really encouraged him to run that last mile. He was stopping to walk a lot as he had to, because the last mile of the Boston Marathon is a fabulous mile. People are cheering. It's right down Boylston Street where the crowds are lined up. And he surprised himself, I think. He told me he wasn't going to do it, but he did it. He actually sped up rather than slow down, and he ran that last mile like a champion, like he was winning the thing, and I was tremendously proud of him. And we crossed the line, and we were still recovering just a few yards over the line when the bombs went off, which was something of a shock. And it really wasn't until later that I realized, once I worked out all the timing, that if he hadn't run that mile as quickly and as bravely as he could, who knows where we might have been when the bombs went off. So it was kind of an existentially shocking moment.
Let's back up to your life, because you talk candidly about eating issues in high school, and you say you may have even had anorexia because you lost 30-some pounds in a matter of months. Yeah. How big an issue was body image for you?
Oh, tremendously. It still is to this day. In fact, I'm told people can see me right now, and I find that horrifying. If I wanted people to see me, I would have not gone into radio. I think it's something that men deal with. We won't say to the same extent as women, certainly not under the same societal pressure to adhere to a model of what you're supposed to look like. But for men, it's something we don't talk about as much. And it's also in adolescence when boys start starving themselves. They usually do it in the context of athletic achievement, cutting weight for wrestling, or in my case, obsessively running. So nobody says, my God, this person is starving themselves, there's a problem, we need to help them. They say, that's great, look at him, he's really improving himself. My goodness, he's quite fit. So it doesn't get as much attention. I'm sure that there are adolescents out there, or former adolescents, who went through the same thing I did, but they never really had a chance to talk about it, and they didn't get the same kind of attention that women deservedly get in that same situation.
And you acknowledge that getting thin didn't necessarily help.
That's the irony, damn it, Phil.
You write that you were, quote, the same hot mess in a smaller bag.
Yeah, you know, that's the tragedy, because I used to say to myself when I was a young pudgy kid, all I need to do is lose weight and then everything will be great. And it turns out, no, it wasn't. I was just skinnier, but still the same person. It turns out the changes I had to make were a little more difficult than the ones I had.
And later on, you have this moment of self-discovery, maybe you suspected it all along, that depression was an issue for you.
Yeah, in a weird way, it's something that I had been struggling with my whole life, but I had masked it by, you know, doing okay, getting good grades, going off to a good college, finally being funny. Being funny is a very good way of masking sadness, depression, and any other kinds of things. You'll know this if you've ever talked to any comedian ever. But it's also something that when things got really dark, as they did when my marriage broke up, you kind of have to deal with, because it's one thing to cope with a depressive tendency when you have no real problems. It's another thing when you do, and one of the reasons I've been open about it, I'm fine, by the way, I don't need anybody's intervention, is I think there are a lot of people, again, out there who are dealing with stuff but feel ashamed, feel isolated, feel alone. And I want to let them know that they're not alone, that there are people maybe like me who you think, oh, have it so much better than you do because I've got this cool job or whatever. But no, everybody struggles with these problems, and nobody should be ashamed, and everybody should get whatever help they need.
And part of the help for you came from running itself. What did running do for you in those
times?
Well,
running did for me a lot of things. It is a natural antidepressant. If you exercise regularly, science says that it provides you with endorphins and other sort of chemical assists to your own mood. I think sometimes simply getting away from it all, if only for an hour, getting outside, getting away from the constant input of digital media, TV, screens, everything like that, that in and of itself will improve your mood. But in the end, it also helped me. I didn't realize this, but all those years I was training to run marathons quickly, efficiently, well, I was actually learning how to deal with a lot of different things. A marathon can, frankly, if I can say this on public TV, it can suck. There are difficult miles, and you learn to get through them by being patient, by running the mile you're in, by keeping your eye on the goal, by understanding that moment leads to a moment, that leads to a moment, that leads to the completion of your goal. And when all of a sudden I was dealing with sort of domestic obstacles that I had no anticipation I'd ever have to deal with, I found that that kind of training, they do call it an endurance sport, helped me to endure.
Because you write that this book was a way to work through the pain of your divorce.
It was. I mean, because a lot of times the only way you can move forward after something terrible happens is to make sense of what just happened. You know, in the military they do after-action reports. What happened? And in some ways this book was a way for me to figure out what exactly happened. How did I get here? How did I get through it? And where have I gotten to? The book is a year in my life from 2013 roughly to 2014 roughly, with lots of trips backwards and forwards in time. But it ends, I hope, on a hopeful note. And people have told me, you know, I'm remarried, extremely happily so. I have two wonderful dogs, which are also great, Dee Dee and Dutchie. My wife likes me to mention them when I'm on TV, Dee Dee and Dutchie.
Got it.
Thank you. And not only am I happy to tell people that story, because it's a cheerful story, people like cheerful stories, this is a true one, but again, I also want to encourage people to know that, you know, no matter what you're going through, there is perhaps a brighter future at the finish line. All you need to do is get there.
How have your three daughters and your ex-wife responded to this book? Or do you know?
They have not, to my knowledge.
I see.
And I hope they read it. There's certainly nothing in it that I think they need to be concerned about. I'm very careful about their privacy. I'm very careful about knowing that they have their own stories and they can tell those stories, and I hope they do when they feel like it. But you know, this is my story. And the things that I needed to talk about or wanted to talk about were things that happened to me, my life, and what I was dealing with. I'm sure they have their own.
Your running spark has dimmed. You're not...
well, I'm not going to try to beat that 309. That's why I'm so intent about it. Remember, 309, never again, but I did do it once.
So what is your running regimen now?
My running regimen now is a daily run, often with my dogs, Dee Dee and Dutchie. Sometimes with my dear friends who are my running friends, sometimes on my own. I run wherever I go around the country, my personal travels or with Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. I do races every now and then, and I'm looking forward to more marathons and more various adventures on two legs to come.
So the marathons are not completely behind you yet?
Oh, absolutely not. There's something about doing something really dumb on a regular basis that I find irresistible.
Keep us posted on your times, Peter.
Well, believe me, as soon as I beat 309, you will be told.
Peter Sagal, thank you so much. Again, the book is The Incomplete Book of Running. You can read an excerpt on our website. And up next, Chicago and one of Bob Dylan's most famous guitarists.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
For the next few months, a museum in downtown Chicago will be home to one of the most notorious musical instruments in history. It is a guitar Bob Dylan played in the summer of 1965 that, in the words of one music critic, electrified one half of his audience and electrocuted the other. Chicago Tonight's Evan Garcia visited the American Writers Museum to learn more.
The American Writers Museum president, Carrie Cranston, is carrying the centerpiece to his museum's newest exhibit, Bob Dylan Electric.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is history.
It's a precious item, and it's unique. It's one of a kind, and it's from a very iconic moment in American history. So to be able to hold that and for 10 seconds before it was put in a locked case was a great opportunity.
July 25th, 1965. Dylan plugs this guitar in for his very first electric live performance.
This guitar really represents a turning point in music and a pivot point in the culture. This incredibly radical moment when Bob Dylan, who was the hero and the darling and the forward face of the folk music revival, turned his attention to rock and roll.
But this wasn't a rock and roll concert. This was the Newport Folk Festival, and the audience didn't hold back.
It's, part of the myth of Dylan at Newport and of Dylan going electric. There were clear creative battle lines that were drawn, and folk music was about tradition and about acoustic instruments and very much in opposition to this rising tide of rock and roll that was seen as silly and trivial.
Soon after that legendary night, Dylan lost his Fender 1964 Stratocaster.
So Dylan had left it on the plane after the festival.
For decades, the guitar was in the possession of a pilot who flew Dylan and several other folk acts during the 1960s.
The pilot's daughter, Dawn Peterson, saw the guitar in a documentary and brought it to the PBS show History Detectives in 2012.
It looked exactly like the guitar that my dad had left in our family's attic.
Experts authenticated it using distinct characteristics.
That crack in the pick guard and that chip that's down there by the knobs.
As well as the guitar's unique wood grain, which is as distinct as a fingerprint, according to some experts.
Initially, Dylan's office was sort of, well, we're not sure, and we're not going to say. But once they were confronted with all of that, also confirmed, yeah, that's the one.
An arrangement was made.
And an arrangement was made.
The details of the arrangement between Dylan and the pilot's daughter aren't public, but soon after, the guitar fetched just under $1 million at Christie's auction house, the most for any guitar sold at auction. The exhibit features Dylan's handwritten lyrics for Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues from the Highway 61 Revisited album. Dylan signed this record in 1965, the year it was released.
Some say the literary aspect of Dylan's music is what sets the 77-year-old songwriter apart from other music legends.
The exhibit fittingly ends on the Nobel Prize in Literature Dylan received in 2016. Dylan did not attend the award ceremony, but in the audio recording of his Nobel lecture, he reflects on 3 literary classics that influenced his writing.
Moby Dick, All Quiet on the Western Front, and the Odyssey.
His speech ends on the Odyssey's opening lines.
I return once again to Homer, who says, "Sing in me, O muse, and through me tell the story."
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Evan Garcia.
Visitors have until the end of April to see Dylan's famous guitar at the American Writers Museum. It's on loan from Indianapolis Colts owner Jim Irsay, who purchased it for $965,000 at auction.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by ComEd. ComEd presents the power of a shiny new toy. By switching to LED holiday light strings this season, you could use up to 50% less energy compared to incandescent light strings. ComEd, powering lives.
From monsters and women novelists to a depressed construction foreman in Belarus, the Chicago theater scene is varied as always. And although the fall season is not quite over, there are a couple of shows to help transition to the holiday season. Joining us to discuss what's on tap on Chicago stages is theater critic Hetty Weiss. Hetty, good to see you as always.
Happy pre-Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much. Same to you. Frankenstein, which you highly recommend. Not only is this production about the novel, but about the process of writing.
It's about Mary Shelley's way into writing it, well, let's just talk about it first. It's a manual cinema production, and this is a company that's existed in Chicago a little bit under the radar for many years, has a reputation already in Europe, and it uses projections, puppets, music, live action, but not dialogue, and every possible thing. It's kind of a logistical nightmare that blossoms. And we see in this scene the creation scene of Frankenstein. The fascinating thing is that it is film projections, it's all-size puppets, it's live actors, as I said, and fantastic percussion and other musicians on stage. And there are so many cues in this thing as they describe, as they tell the story, that if you missed one, it would all be over. But it's actually 70 minutes of really riveting synchronization.
And notwithstanding the lack of dialogue at the Court Theater, it tells the tale effectively.
It does, and of course, most people know at least the basics of the Frankenstein. And this, we were talking before about the creation, and it's Mary Shelley's creation, in spite of the fact that she's competing for writing a horror story with two great romantic poets, her lover, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his friend Lord Byron. So she goes off to the room. They kind of, dismiss her. She goes off to the room and writes the masterpiece. So it's a little bit of, me too.
3 other productions of Frankenstein in Chicago. What's going on?
Yes. Well, this is the 200th anniversary of the publication of the novel. So I would call it a little bit of Frankenstein overkill, but this is a very creative production. Let's
go on to the next one, Mansfield Park, which you highly recommend. Another play based on a novel by a female author. Are you a big Jane Austen fan?
I'm not, but I have found myself falling more in love with the stage productions of her novels than of actually reading the novels. And I don't know quite why that is, but I think it's because the characters really are vivid, and there's something almost Dickensian about them, and they give you a lot to work with. This is a story about social class, money, snobbery, and of course, romantic entanglements. And we see
Jane Austen, in other words.
Jane Austen. It's pure Jane Austen. And we see this scene in which Fanny, the sort of poor relative who's been taken in by the extremely wealthy relatives, is fending off a competitor for the man she likes.
You are such a picture of perfect female manners, Miss Price. Are you out? Out? Do you circulate in society?
No.
Well, I understand why you prefer to stay at home.
So, Fanny, even though she has no money and, is living this kind of horrible life in this mansion, she has such a sense of herself, and that's what ultimately triumphs.
Why does Jane Austen continue to have such a cult following?
I think because somehow, and maybe this is the work of doing it in the theater, it is so of the moment, no matter what the moment is. It is about, women trying to find their place, but it's also just about human relationships, and she's a master of that male-female tension and balance and competition and all of that.
Well, let's switch gears entirely to a play called Tin Soldier, and this is a story about toys, but it's not for children.
No, it's really macabre. It's a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, and it's been adapted by Mary Zimmerman, who of course has this fabulous visual imagination. And we see in this montage the steadfast tin soldier who is missing a leg, but the leg, it's not actually missing. You see the word missing on things. So she does all kinds of clever things. And it's about this soldier who is kind of bullied by everybody, but doesn't really respond. He's just a perpetual victim, but he's kind of a steadfast, suck it up kind of character, and he's the toy in this quite dysfunctional family, which is actually very funny, and I love the maid. It's based on the whole English panto tradition, which
and what is that?
You know, it's a long-lived tradition in England where it's part satire, it's part slapstick, it's part comedy. They do it every Christmas. It's a little bit of cross-dressing, of course. It's British, and it's an entertainment usually for families. But I would say maybe this is not for young children, and it's got a lot of inside jokes about family dynamics.
Let's talk about Radio Culture, which you highly recommend. The play comes from playwright Maxim Dasko from Belarus. What is this about?
This is about, I would call it a day in the life of Volodya or Everyman. It's about a 30-year-old guy who's a construction site manager. It's a relatively good job. He lives in this oppressive country, and he is dealing with his workers, many of whom are alcoholics. It's, you know, former Soviet Republic, whatever. And he tries to just get through the day every day. And there's something about it. It's performed in a storefront with just 25 seats around the border and some scaffolding. And there are two laborers. They never speak. You just see their faces. And it's really, really fascinating. We see the clip where he's just describing how he tries to deal with his workers.
Volodya tries to treat his workers like equals. Like they're all in it together. Even though from the outside, it doesn't seem to work that well.
Yeah, so he's kind of depressive. He sees that there's really no future beyond what he already has, and I think it's kind of easily identifiable with for a lot of people in, you know, tough jobs.
Let's switch to the time of year and Holiday Inn, which you highly recommend, and it's based on the film?
Yes, it's based on the film that starred Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire, and the story was actually written by Irving Berlin, and he also wrote about more than 20 songs that are in the show, some of them borrowed from other sources. He wrote Easter Parade and White Christmas, and what this is about is it's also a rom-com. It's about show business types and competitive love affair, and who chooses career and who chooses a life in the farm, and it has the most fabulous tap dancing and of course amazing American standard songs all throughout it. And there is one scene where there's a tap dancing and jump roping at the same time, which is really quite brilliant.
It looks like there's a lot of eye candy in that production.
It's a lot of eye candy and also just a great spirit.
Hetty, thank you as always for your great spirit. And you can read Hetty's reviews of these shows and others on our website, and back with an encore edition of Ask Jeffrey right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
For many years, sports fans in Chicago were welcomed to games by clean-cut and friendly Andy Frayne ushers. Jeffrey Bear is here with the story of the man behind the House of Ushers in tonight's Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, good to see you.
Always good to be here.
Let's go to that question about the ushers. When I was an Andy Frayne usher in the 1960s, we were everywhere. Baseball, football, hockey, and basketball games, plus professional wrestling, roller derby, and concerts. What happened to them?
Well, they're actually not gone. The company is still in business. In 1996, it did go out of business, but in 1966 it was reopened. Mostly they do security now, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Do you remember the Andy Frayne Ushers?
As a matter of fact, in East Chicago, Indiana, the Andy Frayne Ushers were hired by the Inland Steel Company to work at the annual Christmas party that the company would put on, and the union would put on their own Christmas party a week later.
Yeah, and I used to see them up at Ravinia with their blue uniforms.
They
and
looked
the
very dapper.
Gold braids. They did. They looked very, look at this guy. They looked very official. The ushers were fixtures at most of Chicago's sporting venues and cultural institutions. So the company was started in 1924 by a teenager from back of the yards named Andrew T. Frayne. Family legend is he learned the art of crowd control by directing his 16 siblings in and out of the family's single privy.
Well, that would do it.
Frayne started the usher service as a way for sports stadium owners to end gate crashing and usher bribing, which was rampant in those days. He rounded up some burly friends from the neighborhood and convinced the White Sox that he could do better with his honest, unbribable ushers. 4 years later, Honest Andy won Wrigley Field's business too. Here's some photographic evidence that Andy Frayne can be blamed for the infamous Cubs curse by keeping Sam Sionis's Billy Goat out of Wrigley Field, although this photo looks completely staged to me. William Wrigley Jr. Advanced Andy Frayne the cash to buy the blue uniforms with gold braid that became the Andy Frayne hallmark. Pretty soon, Andy Frayne ushers became an institution themselves. Here's an Andy Frayne usher doing I don't know what at the 1956 Democratic National Convention. If anything was happening, or if anyone of note was in Chicago, like, say, Marilyn Monroe, then Andy Frayne usher was there. The business eventually expanded across the country. Frayne himself never finished grade school. He ran the company with military discipline. Here they are helping Chicago's finest protect the Beatles from fanatic fans.
One of them's holding his ears.
That's right. I love that. Oh, it's so loud. Male ushers had short haircuts. They were clean shaven. And all the ushers, male and female, were required to use polite language, not allowed to slouch, smoke, chew gum, or eat or drink in front of spectators. Many former ushers attribute success later in life to the sort of discipline and training that they received as Andy Frayne ushers.
And how did the ushers do, what did the ushers do besides crowd control?
Oh, well, here you can see they served as drivers. There's Robert F. Kennedy and the mayor there. They also got hired as parking attendants, pallbearers, even emergency prom dates for jilted girls. You could hire an Andy Frayne.
At the last minute.
Yes, you could. And at hockey games, an Andy Frayne usher would sometimes sit in the penalty box between players who had been fighting on the ice. And Frayne even said in an interview that they offered professional criers for funerals.
No kidding.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the end of the story, when Andy Frayne died in 1964, his three sons successfully took over the business. They ran it very well until 1982 when they sold it, and that's when the problems started. The company went through a string of bankruptcies. Finally, in 1996, the trade name was purchased by new owners, and they have been offering security services ever since under the Andy Frayne name.
So there's been a refrain, so to speak.
A refrain,
right.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get to the second question. I seem to recall in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a well-liked police officer who did morning traffic reports for WGN-TV who died when his helicopter crashed. I was quite young at the time, so I'm a bit fuzzy on the details. What can you tell me about this?
Well, you know, we thought we knew who this viewer was talking about, but sadly we learned that there was not one but two helicopter traffic officers in Chicago who died in the line of duty about 10 years apart. The one our viewer remembers is this guy, Patrolman Irv Hayden, who was the voice of WGN's traffic reports for more than 10 years, beginning in 1961. During his time as WGN's Eye in the Sky, he was credited in a Tribune profile with popularizing terms that we use to this day, like Gaper's Block, you know, which of course means the clot of drivers who slow down to look at an accident. And he supposedly also coined the term Hubbard's Cave for that series of expressway underpasses on the Kennedy around Hubbard Street. We've got a clip of Hayden giving a traffic report in 1971 here. Take a listen.
The Kennedy Expressway outbound, we have about a 1-2, maybe a 3-block backup inbound, and this extends that would be inbound to the Tri-State. And then once beyond the Tri-State, the Kennedy Expressway inbound is moving well to River Road. We have a moderate heavy from River Road to Cumberland.
So here's the sad part of the story. Hayden was killed along with his pilot, David Demarest, in August of 1971 when the low-flying helicopter struck power lines and crashed in the suburb of Bellwood. And as if that isn't bad enough, the helicopter traffic reporter who he had succeeded also died in a crash about 10 years before that. His name was Leonard Baldy, Officer Leonard Baldy, there he is. In 1958, Baldy became Chicago's first helicopter traffic reporter on WGN. The 8-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department was assigned to the department's Safety Education Bureau when he joined the force because he had spent time as a CTA bus driver, so he knew the streets well. He'd caution against reckless driving with humorous quips like, "Some drivers are like steel, no good if they lose their temper." And the only time to pass on curves is in a beauty contest.
I'm not sure that line would work today.
Yeah, it wouldn't fly. So we have a clip of Officer Baldy. Here's what he sounded like. We got this from his son, Tim.
We observed that traffic on Roosevelt Road, Congress Expressway, and Madison Street was all moving in an overall slower pattern. Now this is good because though the streets are drying, you may hit an icy patch. This is Flying Officer Leonard Baldy reminding you to keep tuned to WGN.
And unfortunately, in May 1960, as Officer Baldy was flying between reports, the helicopter threw a rotor blade and crashed near Milwaukee Avenue and Hubbard Street. Our floor director, Danny Roskuska, actually remembers that. He just told me. Baldy and the pilot H.G. Ferry were killed in the accident. And in 2006, both of these traffic reporters were memorialized with honorary street signs near the WGN studios here on the north side.
Very nice. Jeffrey, thank you.
My pleasure.
And for more on these and other Ask Jeffrey questions, you can visit our website where you can submit your own questions about Chicago to Jeffrey Bear.
Ask Jeffrey on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Binny's Beverage Depot.
In 1948, Binny's Beverage Depot opened its first store down the street from Wrigley Field. And for almost 70 years, Binny's mission has remained the same, helping you celebrate the best times of your life.
And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. We're off for the holidays starting tomorrow. I hope you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you back here on Monday night. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, serving Chicago as a personal injury law firm since 1984.